Welcome to Farm to Stable, a science-based equine nutrition podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Nettie Liebert. I'm a lifelong horse person and professional equine nutritionist with the goal of helping horses and their humans create balanced diets to set them up for success, no matter what age, discipline, or circumstance. Disclaimer, the information discussed here is based on current scientific research and is for educational purposes only. Every horse's individual needs vary. This is not a substitute for veterinary medicine or nutrition consultation. Welcome to another episode of Farm to Stable, an equine nutrition podcast. I am your host, Dr. Nettie Liebert, and welcome if you are a longtime listener. Thank you if you're brand new to the podcast. Certainly glad to have you here. Now, this week, I wanted to talk a little bit about pro, and post-biotics. This is a very hot topic in the world of equine nutrition and has been for a while. And in fact, research in this area has really ramped up in the past few years, which is wonderful because we really do need a lot more information. So I'm going to try to keep it relatively simple, maybe a little technical, but with explanations as always. So let's get right into it. Probiotics, what are they? So probiotics are defined as a source of live, naturally occurring microorganisms that when you take them orally at adequate concentrations, they provide a benefit beyond that of any nutritional value that they have. And that is a definition according to the World Health Organization. So simply put, a probiotic, it's a live microorganism that confers some kind of a health benefit. You may see a probiotic referred to as a direct-fed microbial. Same thing, different term. We're not really to the point where science completely understands the total composition of the equine microbial population, partly because every horse is different. And that microbial population, and I'll say this a couple of times, depends largely on what that horse's current diet is. And that population could also change throughout the horse's lifetime. We know that the microbial population is a little different in senior horses than it is in younger horses. And whether that's due to age or environment, it could be all of those things. However, there are certain species of bacteria that tend to be found in a healthy horse's digestive tract. Now, I am not a microbiologist. I don't even play one on TV. But in general, there are a couple of bacterial species that are necessary for the digestion of different nutrients. So I'll hit the highlights here. So in the hindgut, you have bacteria that might digest cellulose. So cellulose is something that gives a plant stem rigidity, right? It helps a plant stand up straight. These are called cellulitic bacteria. Now, in other parts of the gut, there could be bacteria that digest protein, called proteolytic bacteria, and starch, called glycolytic bacteria. And there's also lactic acid-producing bacteria, or LABs. And you think, oh, lactic acid, that's what you feel when your muscles are sore. Correct, but there are bugs in the hindgut that produce lactic acid. And again, that's a very important balance. I'm not going to get too far into that today, but they are necessary there. So as I mentioned, the microbial population is very dependent on each individual horse and what they eat. It's one of the reasons why we emphasize to horse owners that if you're going to change your horse's diet, you must do it slowly. And this, again, is why, because the microbial population in your horse is used to a certain diet. And if you make a hard shift, the bacteria that are there potentially could die off. They could not digest the food properly, potentially, and that can cause some digestive upset in your horse. So we want to avoid that. So that's one of the reasons why we tell you to make any changes slowly. It's usually a cooperative relationship, right? You think bacteria, you might go, oh, gross, but they are very important. None of us would be alive and thriving without the bacteria in our bodies. And this is part of the reason why. Because each horse has this unique cooperative relationship with the microbes in the gut, the fermentation of fiber by microbes in the gut helps to allow nutrients to become available for that horse. So I mentioned before cellulose. This is a plant component, right, that helps give the stem rigidity. As I said, any mammal cannot digest cellulose, right? It would just go right through you if there were no bacteria there, but the bacteria can break it down. And I'll get to why that's important. When healthy, the horse's normal microflora or gut population of microbes will also prevent pathogenic or the bad bugs from colonizing in the gut. That's called competitive inhibition. That is a good thing because when you have plenty of good guys, they can keep away the bad guys, very simply put. And remember that a major portion of the horse's immune system comes from the gut. So the healthier the population of microflora, the healthier you can presume your horse will be. It'll support that strong immune system as well as provide really important nutrients. So if you're thinking about incorporating a probiotic feed or supplement, some situations that can affect the horse's microbial population are travel. We know that even short-term travel can affect the content of the horse's microbiome. If your horse is receiving an antibiotic, now obviously that would be necessary for medical reasons at your veterinarian's discretion, but it also kills the good bugs too. So sometimes supplementing of good quality probiotic can be supportive. Horses that have frequent digestive upsets like diarrhea, maybe it'll be helpful. Again, I say maybe because we just don't know all the answers yet. And in fact, a lot of the probiotic supplements out there, they're generally regarded as safe, according to AAFCO, which is the American Association of Feed Control Officials. But we still need to do better. We still need to get a little more specific when it comes to the horse. Long story short, probiotics are the live bacteria that confer a beneficial benefit to the host, or the horse, or the human that takes them in. And these bacteria produce products that the host can use. And again, I'll talk to that as we move into prebiotics. What's the difference between pre and probiotics? First of all, prebiotics are not living organisms at all, which is a little deceiving because the name has the word biotic in it. But prebiotics, think of prebiotics as fiber. Prebiotics are essentially the food that feeds the probiotics, just like that. It's thought that because prebiotics generally provide this food for the probiotics, prebiotics help those good bugs flourish. Like I mentioned earlier, when you have all those good bugs, hopefully you can prevent the bad ones from taking over. So remember that competitive inhibition. Now, common prebiotics, you're probably already feeding them to your horse. Number one, hay, believe it or not, is a prebiotic in a lot of ways. Because remember, hay comes from grass, which is a plant, does contain some cellulose and some other indigestible fibers. That's what the probiotics are going to thrive on. Other things you might hear, oligosaccharides, which include fructooligosaccharides, or FOS, F-O-S, and mannan oligosaccharides, or MOS, or MOS. Also, certain components of yeast. Yeast has become a very popular feed additive and supplement in horse nutrition lately, and for good reason. Yeast cell walls contain something called beta-glucan, as well as MOS. Now, these two things have been shown to really provide a boost to the immune system and a really good boost to the probiotic environment. So, good quality yeast supplement can potentially be beneficial to your horse. Yeast is a whole other topic, but in the spirit of sticking on point with prebiotics and probiotics, we'll save that for another discussion. So we know that horses don't have a set fiber requirement, but we also know that horses need fiber. They have a fiber-based diet. So, in general, we know that that's what they have to eat to have a healthy digestive system. So adequate forage supports that microbial population in the hindgut, as you may have gotten by now. So all forage, again, technically contains prebiotic fiber, serving as that fermentable food source for the bacteria in the hindgut. Now, it's not only hay, it's not only grass. There are some other really good fiber sources that are prebiotic fibers. You may hear them termed super fibers or forage alternatives. The term superfiber, by the way, doesn't really have a scientific definition. It basically, with respect to the diet, means a digestible fiber that helps to promote a healthy gut. So some superfiber examples. We've talked a lot about beet pulp on this podcast, so you can't be surprised to hear me say that. But it is true. Beet pulp is a really good prebiotic, and so are things like soy hulls and oat hulls. You might see these listed on ingredients on your feed tag if you are feeding a concentrate feed. This is not just filler or, miscellaneous ingredients to add bulk. It is not. They have a purpose. They are a really good prebiotic, so don't discount them. Get ready for some science words, okay? So oligosaccharides consist of polysaccharides, meaning basically a large carbohydrate molecule, right? Simplify that. So they're resistant to digestion by mammalian enzymes. So as I mentioned before, these are the types of things that you and I personally cannot digest. We need the probiotics to do the digesting for us. Short or medium chains of fructose make up fructo-oligosaccharides, or FOS, as I mentioned earlier. And these are fermentable by the bacteria in the hindgut. The moss, mannan oligosaccharides, are also fed to horses in some supplements, commercial grain concentrates, but they don't have a direct effect on the microbial population. Here's how this works. This is pretty cool. Moss is thought to stick to the epithelial cells that line the hindgut, basically the skin cells that line the hindgut, and prevent pathogens from attaching. So that's one way they support the immune system, that you're just not allowing the bad bugs to proliferate. And they did some research at Texas A&M University, and they found that these prebiotic supplements that contain FOS or moss actually helped improve digestibility of high-fiber diets. So our horses are all on high-fiber diets, and particularly if your hay quality is not that great or it's very mature, it can help your horse get more nutrition out of it with the moss or FOS supplementation. So that's pretty cool. The FOS also showed that it reduced a lot of changes in the microbial population despite abrupt dietary changes. So this is really promising if you have no choice but to make a hard switch in your horse's diet. And this can happen if horses travel or are sold to a different owner or something of that nature. There's another study from Mississippi State that senior horses might benefit from these short-chain FOS in the diet because senior horses actually did show improvements in nutrient digestibility when this prebiotic was included in the ration. Now, keep in mind, senior horses do not automatically lose the ability to digest and absorb nutrients as they age, but sometimes, especially if you have a hard keeper, and this is something that could potentially help them digest and absorb food more efficiently, that could be really beneficial. All right, I promise not to go on a tangent about yeast, but I'll mention a couple things. Yeast additives can potentially serve as both a pre and a probiotic, so a little bit of a curveball there. Yeast is actually alive, but it can also be supplemented not alive. Particularly, we're talking about Saccharomyces cerevisiae. So in most horse supplements, you're going to see that as the source of the yeast. Now, they looked at ruminants. Ruminants are cows, goats, so ruminants have a different digestive system than horses. But for example, they added yeast to the diet of ruminants to see if it improved fiber digestion directly or by supporting the bacterial population to do so. And the same apparently was looked at in horses, and early studies with the yeast supplementation showed that it could alter fermentation in the hindgut, especially when low forage or high concentrate diets were fed. So that decline in cecal pH as a result of a high concentrate diet was actually attenuated in horses that got the higher starch or the very low forage diet supplements with yeast culture. So that has promise. It doesn't mean it's a license to feed a ton of grain and not enough forage and just give them yeast. However, there are situations where that does happen. So remember, the cell walls of yeast contain that good stuff, the beta-glucans, which are released during fermentation, and that has been shown to help support that healthy microbiome with particular positive influence on the immune system. We love that, especially as I record this. We're coming into the colder months here in the Northeast United States, and everybody worries about getting sick. Even your horses, you want to keep an eye on them. So any immune support we can give them. More research at the University of Kentucky when it comes to senior horses suggested that supplementing the senior horses with some of these prebiotic fibers may help support their immune system as well. For all of you senior horse owners out there, myself included, keep that in mind as you take a winter evaluation of your horse's diet. So last, post-biotics. So you may not have heard this term years and years and years ago. It's sort of a newer term, but essentially they've been around a long time. Post-biotics are non-viable, meaning non-living, products of bacterial fermentation. So once the bacteria once the probiotics ferment the prebiotics, what you have left are postbiotics. And typically you might think after you digest something, it's just all waste products. And that's not entirely true, because what you get out of those could be very beneficial to the horse. Post-biotics can be released if the cell is broken as well and its contents get dispersed. But examples of post-biotics include something called volatile fatty acids. And volatile fatty acids are something that the horse uses as a building block to make energy without the use of, say, carbohydrates or starch and sugar. So they can take those volatile fatty acids and actually make energy. Other byproducts of fermentation include B vitamins. It's one of the reasons that horses are thought to not have a dietary requirement for B vitamins, because the bacteria in the microbiome produce it. How much is absorbed, we're still learning, but horses generally seem to be doing okay. Vitamin K is another example. And there are also peptides that can slow or inhibit the growth of bad bugs, and we've talked about that a little bit. Now, it's sort of a newer area of research in this area, but there are some studies, one in particular, another from the University of Kentucky, suggests that postbiotics that are supplemented to senior horses may influence the expression of pre- and pro-inflammatory gene markers in a positive way. More to be determined, so a lot of these are very preliminary. Another study from Texas A&M suggested that this postbiotic from, again, our yeast friend, Saccharomyces cerevisiae, might favorably modulate intra-articular inflammation, or within the joint inflammation, in young horses subjected to a challenge there. There's some more research coming out of industry that suggests that this same yeast, postbiotic, could help manage stress. So if you have a horse that gets very stressed out, it is possible that some of these postbiotics coming from yeast potentially could be helpful. One last thing. You may hear the term synbiotic, S-Y-N, biotic. Basically, it's a combination of pre- and probiotics, essentially. Just a little side note there. So this was designed to give you a very brief overview of pre, pro, and post-biotics. I hope it has answered more questions than it has created in the scientific world. There are many, many, many questions still being investigated when it comes to probiotics and what is exactly appropriate for the horse, at what time, are there differences by age, sex, breed. We know, as I mentioned earlier, that there are differences in every individual horse, just like no two humans are exactly the same. No two horses are exactly the same, but we do know that that microbial population is very heavily influenced by the type of diet the horse is eating at that one time. I will say one other thing. To date, as of right now, the probiotics that we supplement to horses, as I mentioned, they're generally regarded as safe, but they typically do not colonize the hindgut. So in order for a probiotic to be very successful, if it's a good bug, we want it to colonize and produce in the hindgut so that it does all of its good things. But when you supplement that probiotic, it can be found and measured usually in the feces, in the poop, if you analyze it and you send it off to the lab. And once you stop supplementing currently commercially available probiotics, it'll typically go away. So that's an indication that it's not colonizing. Now, that doesn't mean that it's a waste of time. A lot of that still has to be determined by research. But as I mentioned earlier, if you have a horse under certain stressful conditions, whether they're getting on a trailer or perhaps they're on an antibiotic, to our knowledge, it is not harmful to supplement some of the probiotics that are commercially available. Last thing I'll say about that, buyer beware. Not all probiotic supplements are created equal, so keep an eye out for the NASC label, the little yellow oval, that at least guarantees that what the supplier says is in the product is actually in there. It doesn't guarantee that it works, just guarantees that it's in there. So again, I hope I have at least given you some insight into the world of pre, pro, and postbiotics and why we still need research and why we still have a lot of questions. But in general, if you have a topic in mind or a question you'd like answered, feel free to reach out at equinenutritionphd@yahoo.com. Thank you so much for listening. If you are in a cold climate, stay warm as you head out to take care of your horses this winter. The struggle is real, and we will catch you next time on Farm to Stable. Thank you for listening. Thank you for listening to the latest episode of Farm to Stable, a science-based equine nutrition podcast. Please share and subscribe if you found the content interesting, and if you have a topic you'd like to hear about, send it to equinenutritionphd@yahoo.com.